It was supposed to be a quiet morning, the kind that started with mist rising off Lake Seminole, a husband setting out before dawn to hunt ducks, and a family waiting for him to come home. But Jerry Michael Mike Williams never did. For years, people believed the lake had swallowed him whole. Then nearly 2 decades later, the truth emerged, darker and colder than anyone could have imagined. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this deep dive into unsolved mysteries, please hit that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment where you're watching from and what time it is. Because tonight we uncover how a man's disappearance became one of Florida's most haunting betrayals. Mike Williams had built his life piece by piece, every bit of it earned. He was the kind of man who didn't take shortcuts. People around Tallahassee described him as steady, grounded, and reliable to the core, the kind of person you trusted with your car keys, your property appraisal, or your life. And that was exactly what made his story so haunting, because if a man like Mike could vanish, what did that say about the world he lived in? He was born on October 16, 1969 in Bradfordville, Florida, a small, tight-knit community just north of Tallahassee. His parents, Jerry and Cheryl Williams, worked hard to give their 2 boys a chance at something better. His father drove a Greyhound bus for long, grueling hours, while his mother ran a daycare out of their modest double-wide trailer. They didn't have much, but they had love and they had ambition. From an early age, Mike learned what it meant to work, really work. By high school, he was waking up before dawn to stack shelves in a local grocery store before class. When his classmates were spending weekends at the lake, Mike was saving money to help his parents cover tuition at North Florida Christian High School. There, he didn't just blend in, he thrived. He played football, served as student council president, and joined the Key Club, volunteering in community projects whenever he could. Teachers described him as respectful, focused, and almost old-fashioned in his values. But beneath that polite, all-American surface, Mike had ambition burning in him. He wanted more than just stability. He wanted to build a life that mattered. When he graduated, he went on to Florida State University, where he majored in political science and urban planning. It was during those years that he met a fellow student named Denise Merrill, bright, composed, and from a good family. They fell into a quick romance that turned into something more serious by graduation. After college, Mike landed a job at Ketchum Appraisal Group, a respected property appraisal firm in Tallahassee. It was the perfect fit for him. Long hours, detail-oriented work, and room to grow. He wasn't flashy about his success, but everyone noticed how quickly he was climbing. The company's owner once said, "Mike was the hardest working man I ever saw. He'd work a full day, go home to see his wife and daughter, and then come back after dinner to finish reports. You just don't see that kind of dedication anymore." By the late 1990s, Mike was earning over $200,000 a year, a remarkable figure for someone his age and background. He and Denise moved into a quiet upscale subdivision on the east side of Tallahassee, a neighborhood lined with magnolia trees and perfect lawns. To friends, it seemed like a dream. The handsome, hard-working husband, the beautiful, loyal wife, and their baby girl, born in 1999, who completed the picture. But every dream has shadows. Mike's life revolved around his family, maybe too much. He adored his daughter, taking her fishing on weekends, tucking her in every night, and talking about plans for a bigger home, maybe another child. He attended church every Sunday, brought Denise flowers just because, and doted on her in a way friends sometimes found almost excessive. He believed in loyalty, in commitment, in doing things the right way. But while Mike was living by those values, someone else wasn't. Denise, his high school sweetheart, had grown into a woman who valued control and comfort. She liked the safety of their life, but quietly resented the long hours Mike worked, and the simplicity of his dreams. Their marriage, though seemingly solid, carried small fractures that neither talked about. Mike didn't know it then, but the person he trusted most was already drifting toward someone else. Brian Winchester had been a classmate of theirs back in high school, charming, funny, and outgoing. He and Mike shared a love of duck hunting, and their friendship had only grown through adulthood. Brian was also in the insurance business, and by 1999 he'd helped Mike secure a large life insurance policy, over $1 million worth of coverage. It was a logical move for a man with a young family, and Mike didn't think twice about it. But behind that signature on the paperwork, a darker plan was quietly taking form. Those who knew Denise and Brian later recalled an unsettling closeness between them. They spent time together outside of work, exchanged long phone calls, and shared secrets that didn't seem appropriate for a married woman and her husband's best friend. To outsiders, it looked harmless, but to those who noticed the subtle tension between Mike and Denise, it was clear something wasn't right. Still, Mike never suspected betrayal. He was too focused on providing, too consumed with the weight of responsibility. The couple had even talked about having another child, a plan that reassured him that their family and their future was strong. Then, 2 days before his disappearance, Mike had dinner with his mother and brother. He told them he and Denise were planning a vacation to Hawaii for their anniversary. He spoke with excitement, talking about how much he was looking forward to the trip. It was an ordinary conversation, one of love, hope, and plans for the future. No one in that room knew it would be the last time they'd see him alive. The morning of December 16, 2000, was cold and quiet. The temperature hovered near freezing, unusual for Florida. Mike woke up before dawn, as he often did on weekends, ready to head out duck hunting at Lake Seminole near the Georgia-Florida line. Hunting was his passion, something he'd done since he was a teenager. It was his ritual, a peaceful escape before the day's chaos began. Denise said goodbye from the doorway. Mike loaded his gear, hooked his aluminum boat to the back of his Ford Bronco, and drove into the darkness. He told her he'd be home by noon. Plenty of time to get ready for their anniversary dinner in Apalachicola that evening. He never came back. By that night, panic had turned into dread. His mother called his phone over and over, no answer. His best friend Brian Winchester joined the search, combing through the fog-shrouded lake where Mike was last seen. They found his truck parked neatly near the boat ramp, keys inside. The boat was discovered drifting not far from shore. Shotgun inside, life jacket untouched. No body. No sign of struggle. Just still water and silence. To the world, it looked like a tragic accident, a hunter gone missing. But for Cheryl Williams, it felt like something else, something colder, something calculated, because her son knew those waters too well to make a mistake like that. And deep down she felt it. Mike hadn't disappeared. He'd been taken. The mystery of what really happened that December morning was only beginning to unfold. That winter sunrise over Lake Seminole marked not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a conspiracy that would take 17 years to unravel. The morning of December 16, 2000 began in silence. The world outside Tallahassee was still and heavy with fog, the kind that swallowed the horizon and muffled sound. Lake Seminole stretched out like a ghost, its water dark, its surface unmoving. For hunters like Mike Williams, this was paradise. For his wife Denise, it was routine. He'd done it countless times before, leaving long before dawn, promising to return by lunch. But this time lunch came and went. Then the sun began to sink, and the silence that hung over Lake Seminole began to feel unnatural. By noon, Denise called her father, Warren Morrell. Her voice trembled, but she remained composed, something those who knew her would later describe as unsettlingly calm. She told him Mike hadn't come home. He wasn't answering his phone. He should have been back hours ago. Within minutes, Warren and Brian Winchester, Mike's closest friend, were in their trucks, racing toward the lake where Mike was known to hunt. When they arrived, the fog had lifted, revealing the still waters of Stump Field, a treacherous part of the lake filled with half-submerged tree stumps from an old orchard that once stood there. Hunters knew to move carefully here. One wrong turn could splinter a boat in seconds. They spotted Mike's Ford Bronco parked neatly near the ramp, the trailer empty. The engine was off. The door was locked. Everything looked normal except for one thing. There was no sign of Mike. As the sun dipped lower, Brian and Warren scanned the waterline. That's when they noticed a small aluminum boat bobbing quietly in the cove, about 70 yards from shore. It was Mike's. A helicopter pilot helping in the search spotted it from the air and directed rescuers to it. Inside, Mike's shotgun lay still in its case and dry and clean. No life jacket, no footprints, no torn fabric. It was as if the man had simply vanished. Within hours, local law enforcement and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission launched a full-scale search. Dozens of officers and volunteers arrived. Helicopters hovered overhead. Boats fanned across the lake and divers entered the icy water. The temperature had dropped sharply that week, dipping close to freezing. The air was thick with tension and disbelief. Searchers assumed the simplest explanation, that Mike had hit a stump, fallen overboard, and drowned. It happened before, they said. Hunting accidents weren't uncommon. The working theory was that his waders, filled with water, had pulled him down. They expected his body to surface within a few days, as was typical in drowning cases. But as the days turned into weeks, the water remained silent. Divers scoured 10 acres around the site. They used sonar equipment, dragged nets, even brought in cadaver dogs when the visibility grew poor. But nothing. Not a single trace. No body, no clothing, not even a glove. Locals began whispering about the alligators. Lake Seminole, after all, was notorious for them. Some speculated that Mike's body had been eaten, an explanation that seemed to fit the mystery, at least on the surface. The idea spread quickly, offered almost as comfort. Because if the alligators were responsible, then no one else was. Still, Cheryl Williams didn't believe it. She'd grown up in that area. She knew the lake. She knew its cycles. If he drowned, she told anyone who'd listen, he would have come up. But to the authorities, the case was simple enough. A missing hunter. No signs of foul play. No body to prove otherwise. By early February 2001, the search was officially called off. The case was closed as a presumed drowning. 2 weeks later, Denise Williams arranged a memorial service. There was no body, only a framed photo placed near the altar. Friends spoke of Mike's kindness, his faith, his dedication to family. Denise wept quietly, flanked by Brian Winchester, her late husband's best friend. To the outside world, it was the tragic ending of a love story. To Cheryl, it was the beginning of something else entirely. She couldn't let it go. Something about the sequence of events felt too neat, too orchestrated. She replayed it in her mind. Mike leaves before dawn. Brian, conveniently, is the one to find his truck and boat. The waders, jacket, and flashlight found months later. All too perfect. Too preserved. And then there was the life insurance. Just months before Mike disappeared, he'd taken out 3 life insurance policies totaling more than $1.5 million. The man who sold him those policies? Brian Winchester. Still, Cheryl tried to give Denise the benefit of the doubt. She wanted to believe that her daughter-in-law was grieving honestly. But Denise's actions told another story. In June 2001, 6 months after Mike's disappearance, a fisherman found a pair of waders floating in the lake. Nearby, searchers recovered a hunting jacket and flashlight. In the jacket pocket was a laminated hunting license with Mike's signature. The timing was strange. The items were in unusually good condition, with no visible signs of decay or teeth marks. Forensic analysis later found no DNA, no algae growth, no sediment that matched the 6 months they supposedly spent underwater. And yet, just 1 week later, Denise petitioned the court to declare her husband legally dead. The process was swift, suspiciously so. Most states required a waiting period of 5 years for missing persons before a death declaration could be granted. But Denise's request sailed through, backed by the discovery of her husband's belongings. She received the life insurance payout shortly afterward. To Cheryl, the message was clear. Someone wanted her son gone. But the world moved on. The case faded from headlines. Denise remarried in 2005 to Brian Winchester, the same man who helped her search the lake, who sold Mike the insurance, and who stood beside her at the memorial service. They moved into the same home she once shared with Mike, living quietly as if the past had been erased. For years, it seemed like the mystery of Lake Seminole would remain unsolved, just another tragedy written off as a freak accident. But Cheryl never gave up. Every holiday, every birthday, she mailed letters to the governor, to the police, to anyone who would listen. She demanded the investigation be reopened. Her neighbors saw her as the woman who couldn't move on. But Cheryl knew something the rest of the world didn't. She could feel it in her bones. Her son hadn't drowned, because no amount of water could wash away a lie that deep. And somewhere in the stillness of Lake Seminole, she believed the truth was waiting to surface. As the years passed and the story faded from the news, Cheryl kept fighting alone, not knowing that one day, her persistence would tear open the perfect lie Denise and Brian had built. When the search for Mike Williams was officially called off in early 2001, Most families would have accepted the grim conclusion. A tragic accident? A life lost to the unpredictable waters of Lake Seminole. But Cheryl Williams wasn't most families. She refused to let bureaucracy or exhaustion bury her son's story beneath paperwork and pity. For Cheryl, grief became fuel. Each morning she rose before dawn, made a cup of black coffee, and sat down at her kitchen table with a pen and a stack of paper. Her handwriting was small but firm, her words careful yet unrelenting. Every letter began the same way. To the governor of Florida, my son, Jerry Michael Williams, is missing, and I believe he was murdered. She mailed one every single day. As weeks turned into months, she expanded her reach, writing to the FDLE, the sheriff's office, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission, even the local news stations. Her tone never softened. She demanded answers, updates, truth. And though most officials filed her letters away quietly, a few began to take notice, but persistence comes at a cost. Her husband, who had already buried a son in his heart, couldn't bear to reopen the wound each morning. He begged her to stop, to let the family heal. Her surviving son, Nick, distanced himself, unable to watch his mother live in perpetual torment. Friends stopped visiting. Even members of her church, once supportive, began to whisper that she had gone too far, that grief had turned to obsession. Still, Cheryl refused to yield. She started small, stapling flyers to telephone poles across Tallahassee. The paper faded under the sun, but she replaced each one by hand. Then she escalated. She paid for advertisements in local newspapers that read, "Reward for information. My son didn't drown." When that didn't work, she rented a billboard along one of the busiest roads leading into the Capitol. In bold letters it asked, "Where is Mike Williams?" She didn't know it yet, but that sign, and the woman behind it, would become the heartbeat of a case no one wanted to touch. In 2002, she took her fight to the State House itself. She stood outside the Florida Capitol building in the humid air, clutching photographs of Mike in his hunting gear, his smile frozen in time. She told every reporter who'd listen, "My son didn't drown. Someone did this to him." At first, most saw her as a mother who couldn't move on, the kind of woman who refused to accept reality. But her unwavering conviction began to plant seeds of doubt, even among those who once dismissed her. The alligator theory, as it came to be called, had holes. Experts began pointing out that alligators don't feed in cold weather, and the items found months after Mike's disappearance, his waders, jacket, and license, showed no signs of being submerged for long. Still, none of it was enough. Not without a body, not without evidence. Then in 2004, something shifted. Cheryl's letters had finally made their way to the desk of an FDLE agent who couldn't ignore the inconsistencies anymore. That spring, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement officially reopened the case of Jerry Michael Williams. For Cheryl, it was a small victory, but it was also validation. She hadn't been wrong. She hadn't been crazy. Her son had been taken from her. Investigators began retracing the timeline of Mike's disappearance. They re-interviewed witnesses, searched the lake again, and combed through the insurance policies. The more they dug, the stranger things became. The life insurance totaled over $1.5 million, an extraordinary sum for a man his age. The policies had been handled by none other than Brian Winchester, Mike's longtime friend and fellow hunter. Investigators noted that Brian and Denise had grown close after Mike's death. Too close. By 2005, their relationship was no longer a secret. They had married quietly and moved into the same house Denise once shared with Mike. The community whispered, but no one dared accuse them outright. To Cheryl, that marriage was the final confirmation of what her heart had screamed all along. Her son's disappearance wasn't an accident. It was premeditated, but suspicion isn't evidence. Investigators had no physical proof, no body, no weapon, no crime scene. Lake Seminole had become a watery graveyard of possibilities, and without a single tangible clue, there was nothing to charge, nothing to convict. The FDLE inquiry fizzled once again. For Cheryl, it was another heartbreak, another bureaucratic shrug, but she refused to stop. She told reporters, "They may have buried my son, but they won't bury the truth." Over the years, her campaign became legend among cold case detectives. an example of relentless advocacy. Each time the case stalled, she found new ways to make noise. She emailed news anchors, stood outside court buildings, and showed up at public events with binders full of timelines, maps, and letters. When others saw walls, Cheryl saw cracks. She even investigated on her own, talking to locals, hiring private divers, and researching lake conditions during that winter. She learned that the water temperature had been too cold for alligators to be active. She learned that drowning victims almost always resurfaced within days. And she learned that the discovery of Mike's belongings 6 months later, all neatly intact, defied logic. In interviews, her voice never wavered. "If they think I'll stop," she said, "they don't know a mother's love." But as the years dragged on, hope began to fade. The state declined to pursue charges. Tips dried up. News coverage waned. Even some in law enforcement began to believe the truth would never surface. Denise and Brian, meanwhile, carried on with their lives. They attended church, raised their children, and were seen at local gatherings. From the outside, they looked like a couple who had survived tragedy and moved forward. But to Cheryl, they were living ghosts, walking reminders of the life they had stolen. Every year on the anniversary of Mike's disappearance, Cheryl stood outside the Capitol holding a sign that read, "Remember Mike Williams." Sometimes no one stopped. Sometimes a stranger offered a quiet word of support, but she never missed a year. Her body aged, her hands trembled more, but her spirit never broke. Because she believed with every breath that one day, someone would slip or speak or confess. And when that day came, she'd be ready. The state might have closed its file, but Cheryl's investigation never ended. She kept detailed binders, documenting every conversation, every article, every unanswered question. She became an expert on her son's case, more knowledgeable than most of the detectives who had once dismissed her. By 2010, even investigators privately admitted what they'd once denied. Nothing about Mike Williams's disappearance added up. The drowning had been too clean, the evidence too convenient, but without a confession they were still chasing ghosts. For Cheryl, every unanswered question echoed louder than the one before. She prayed nightly, asking God to let her son's truth be known, even if it meant waiting the rest of her life. She had no idea that, years later, one desperate act and one terrified man would finally bring her that truth. For 16 years, Cheryl fought alone, but in 2016, the man she'd suspected all along, Brian Winchester, would make a single decision that would unravel everything. For most of Florida, the story was settled. An unfortunate accident swallowed by nature itself. A man drowned, his body never recovered, and a grieving widow left behind to pick up the pieces. On paper, it made sense. Lake Seminole was known for its murky waters, its thick weeds, and its alligators. The explanation had an eerie poetry to it. The lake had simply claimed another life. People liked the alligator story because it was horrifying yet simple. It gave them closure without confrontation. But for those who looked closer, it didn't hold water. Literally, alligators, it turns out, don't feed in winter. The temperature that December had dropped near freezing. Any predator in those waters would have been dormant, sluggish, uninterested in hunting. The science alone made the theory fall apart. But it was easier to believe a story about nature's cruelty than to face the idea that human hands had caused it. Still, the myth persisted. Newspapers ran with it. Law enforcement accepted it, and Denise Williams quietly moved on. Within a year of Mike's disappearance, Denise sold their home, the one they'd once dreamed of raising a second child in, and moved into a new house across town. The decision seemed logical, even healing. Too many memories, she told friends. They nodded sympathetically, but what they didn't know was that she wasn't moving on alone. Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend, the man who'd sold him his life insurance, the man who'd searched the lake the day he went missing, had become her shadow. Their closeness grew less secretive and more visible over time. They were seen together at church, at social gatherings, and eventually, living under the same roof. In 2005, the two were married. To the public, it seemed like a love story born from tragedy. Two people finding comfort after unimaginable loss. But to Cheryl Williams, it was the final betrayal. She saw it not as love, but as motive. They didn't just take his life, she would later say. They took his future and lived it themselves. Denise and Brian built what appeared to be a perfect suburban life. They joined a church, attended community events, and appeared devoted to Denise's young daughter. On the surface, everything looked polished. But to those who paid attention, there were cracks. Brian was restless, irritable. He had nightmares. He began drinking more, lashing out, becoming paranoid about the past. At work, coworkers noticed a change. The charm that once defined him had given way to tension. He was easily startled, overly cautious, and always seemed to be watching his back. Denise, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. Once soft-spoken and social, she became cold, rigid, controlling. She cut off old friends, distanced herself from Mike's family, and refused any contact with Cheryl. When Cheryl tried to send birthday gifts or letters to her granddaughter, they were returned unopened. Denise told her daughter, Mike's daughter, that Cheryl was not safe, that she was unstable, that it was better to stay away. It was a manipulation wrapped in maternal concern, and it worked. Cheryl's last connection to her son, his only child, was severed. Still, she didn't stop. Every December 16th, Cheryl drove to the Florida state capitol and stood outside with a homemade sign that read in bold black letters, "Where's my son?" Some days it rained. Some days it burned with Florida heat. She stood there regardless, alone, year after year, holding that sign while people hurried past. Sometimes drivers honked in support. Sometimes they rolled their windows down to shout cruel things. "Let it go. Move on. He's gone." But Cheryl didn't move. She couldn't. Every time she looked at the water on the news, every time she saw a story about another missing person, she thought of Mike. She thought of his quiet laugh, his love for his little girl, his habit of calling her every night before bed. And she thought of Denise, the woman who now lived with the man who had been his best friend. In 2011, Disappeared, a show on investigation discovery, aired an episode about Mike's case. It reignited public curiosity. The producers interviewed Cheryl extensively, portraying her as the relentless mother who never gave up. The episode was emotional and raw, but it also left viewers unsettled. The story of the man eaten by alligators felt more like fiction than truth. After the episode aired, Cheryl began receiving letters and phone calls from strangers who had their own theories. Some offered sympathy, others offered wild speculation. None brought closure. But the renewed attention brought new pressure on law enforcement to take another look at the case. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted that things had never added up. The life insurance connection, the lack of remains, the speed of the death declaration. But with no body, no crime scene, and no eyewitnesses, they were at a dead end. Meanwhile, Denise and Brian's marriage began to erode. The same paranoia that had driven Brian's nightmares began poisoning their relationship. He became controlling, suspicious, and increasingly afraid that someone would discover what they had done. Denise, in turn, began to pull away. Their perfect life was beginning to collapse under the weight of the secret they shared. Brian's friends later recalled that he would bring up Mike's disappearance unexpectedly, usually after a few drinks. "If they ever find him," he once said to a colleague, "they'll never believe what really happened." No one knew what to make of it then. But those words would echo years later when the truth finally came to light. Denise tried to maintain appearances. She was active in her church, volunteered for school functions, and lived in quiet comfort. But inside she was living in constant fear. She knew Brian was unraveling, and that if he broke, their entire world would. Cheryl could sense something shifting too. Even without evidence, she could feel that the story was far from over. She kept in contact with the FDLE, reminding them of every inconsistency, every red flag. One investigator later said, "She was like gravity. You couldn't ignore her. Every time we moved on to other cases, she pulled us back." Still, years passed. The world changed. Technology advanced. But Lake Seminole remained silent. And then in the fall of 2015, Cheryl heard something that made her pulse quicken. Brian and Denise Winchester, the couple who had once seemed inseparable, had quietly separated. Rumors of arguments, threats, and police calls had begun to circulate. For Cheryl, it was more than gossip. It was the sound of a crack in the armor. Because when two people share a secret that deadly, all it takes is one fracture for everything to come pouring out. The alligator story had hidden a murder for 15 years. But guilt, like the lake, has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. As Brian and Denise's marriage began to collapse, the secret they'd buried so carefully was finally beginning to stir, and soon, one desperate act would bring it all crashing down. 15 years is a long time for silence to hold. Long enough for memories to blur, for rumors to settle, and for a mother's hope to seem like delusion. But Cheryl Williams never surrendered. While the world moved on, she kept her son's name alive. By the mid-2010s, the case of Mike Williams had become little more than a cold entry in the archives of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Detectives had retired, leads had faded, and the once vivid story of a man swallowed by Lake Seminole had hardened into myth, but myths have a strange way of returning, especially when guilt begins to eat away at those who created them. For Brian Winchester and Denise Williams, life after Mike had not turned into the quiet happily ever after they'd envisioned. Their marriage, born out of secrecy and cemented in deceit, had begun to rot from within. At first, things had seemed perfect. Brian had provided stability, Denise the illusion of peace. They attended church together, smiled in public, and raised Denise's daughter as their own. But beneath that suburban veneer was paranoia, a shared unspoken fear that one day someone would start asking the right questions again. Brian had always been the nervous one. Friends noticed it in small ways. How he avoided talking about hunting or Lake Seminole, how he flinched whenever Cheryl's name came up on the news. He'd quit drinking, then started again. He'd changed jobs. He began locking his bedroom door at night. Denise, meanwhile, remained outwardly composed but inwardly calculating. Those close to her said she had become colder over time, detached even from Brian. Their once secret love had turned toxic. She had the money, the home, and her daughter, but she no longer needed him. And that terrified Brian. He knew what they had done together. He knew where Mike's body was buried. And he knew that if Denise ever decided to turn on him, he would be the one who took the fall. By 2012, their marriage was unraveling in slow motion. They fought constantly, about money, about trust, about the looming specter of the past. Denise began avoiding him, refusing to answer calls or texts. She filed for divorce quietly, hoping to sever ties without drama. But Brian couldn't let go. The thought of Denise leaving, of her cutting him off after everything they'd shared, everything they'd done, sent him spiraling. He started stalking her, parking near her home, following her to work. She began to fear him, but not because she was innocent, because she knew he was unstable enough to talk. In early 2016, the situation reached its breaking point. On August 5th, Denise was driving to her job at Florida State University when she noticed something unsettling, a car tailing her closely along the highway. She recognized the vehicle immediately. It was Brian's. Before she could react, he pulled alongside her, motioning for her to stop. When she refused, he swerved in front, forcing her off the road. Panicked, Denise tried to escape. But Brian approached her with a gun in hand. What happened next was later pieced together through her statement to police. Brian climbed into her car, pointed the weapon at her, and began to beg not for forgiveness but for silence. He told her he couldn't lose her, that if she went through with the divorce, his life would be over. He ranted about loyalty, about secrets, about how much they'd already sacrificed. Denise pleaded for her life, promising she wouldn't tell anyone. After several tense minutes, Brian broke down crying, lowered the gun, and let her go. She drove straight to a police station. By nightfall, Brian Winchester was in custody. The news hit Tallahassee like a thunderclap. For 15 years, the Lake Seminole disappearance had been nothing more than a tragic footnote. But suddenly, the man long suspected by Cheryl Williams, the man she had named in interviews and letters, was behind bars. And not for a minor offense, but for kidnapping the very woman he'd married after her husband vanished. Investigators immediately took notice. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. The abduction hinted at something deeper, something desperate. When detectives interviewed Brian, his demeanor shifted between anger and fear. He seemed paranoid, twitchy, unstable. He avoided eye contact whenever Mike's name came up. One detective later recalled, "You could see it in his eyes." He was terrified, not of prison, but of what we might already know. The FDLE reopened the case file once again. The dots began to realign. The life insurance, the marriage, the missing body. the waders and jacket that had conveniently surfaced 6 months after Mike's disappearance. Everything pointed back to Brian and Denise. But Denise, ever composed, claimed victimhood. She painted Brian as an obsessed, controlling husband. In public, she portrayed herself as a survivor of domestic abuse, not an accomplice to murder. Her story held mouse for a while. Meanwhile, Cheryl Williams was watching from her home, glued to the television, her heart pounding as she saw Brian's mugshot appear on the news. "This is it," she told reporters. "This is the beginning of the truth." She wasn't wrong. With Brian now serving a 20-year sentence for armed kidnapping, investigators saw an opportunity. Leverage. They knew fear had driven him to that act. Fear of losing Denise, fear of exposure, fear that the secret he'd buried, and literally, would no longer stay hidden. For months, they quietly built pressure. They visited him in prison, offering deals, listening for cracks in his resolve. They didn't push too hard. They didn't have to. The silence between him and Denise was already doing the work for them. Isolated, betrayed, and imprisoned, Brian began to spiral. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He felt abandoned by the woman he had killed for. And when the FDLE showed up one last time in 2017, with photographs, questions, and the word murder whispered into the conversation, something finally broke. He asked for a deal. Immunity for the truth. And when they agreed, he told them everything. He described how on that foggy December morning in 2000, he and Mike had gone duck hunting together. How Denise had kissed her husband goodbye, knowing he would never return. How Brian had lured his best friend into the lake under the pretense of retrieving decoys, intending for him to drown, and how when the plan failed, he'd pulled the trigger instead. For investigators, the confession was the key they'd been waiting for. For Cheryl, it was vindication. 15 years of letters. 15 years of disbelief. 15 years of standing alone with a sign that read, "Where's my son?" And now, finally, someone had answered. But one question still lingered. Where was Mike Williams? Brian knew the answer. And what he told them next would lead investigators to one of the darkest discoveries in Florida's cold case. History, Brian's confession had shattered the silence, but as detectives prepared to dig into the spot he pointed to on the map, no one was ready for what they were about to uncover beneath the dirt near Lake Seminole. When Brian Winchester was locked away in a Florida prison in 2016, many assumed that chapter of the Lake Seminole mystery had finally closed. A deranged husband arrested for kidnapping his wife. Tragic but unconnected to the legend of the missing hunter. To the casual observer, it was just another dark headline, but to those who had followed Mike Williams' story, to Cheryl, to the FDLE agents who remembered the case that never sat right, it was a crack in a long-sealed tomb. And through that crack, the truth began to pour out. Inside his cell, Brian Winchester sat with the weight of a secret that had defined his life for 17 years. He'd carried it through holidays, anniversaries, and sleepless nights. Every time he'd looked into his wife's eyes, the widow-turned accomplice, he'd seen not love but shared guilt. Now she wouldn't even answer his letters. His last ally had abandoned him. That isolation became leverage. When FDLE agents reopened Mike Williams's case, they came with purpose. They had no new evidence, no new witnesses, but they had the one thing that mattered most: time. Time had eroded Brian's loyalty, his confidence, and his control. Detectives began where everything had gone wrong the first time, with the details everyone had accepted too easily. They reviewed the waders and jacket found 6 months after the disappearance. They re-examined the life insurance policies that Brian himself had sold to Mike. They questioned why Denise had been able to declare her husband dead so quickly. And they couldn't ignore the strange convenience of her second marriage, to the same man who'd orchestrated the search for her first. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an accident. It was a design. When investigators approached Brian in 2017, they didn't accuse him outright. They talked calmly, almost conversationally, reminding him that his kidnapping conviction had cost him everything: his marriage, his freedom, his reputation. Then they offered him something rare, a path toward redemption. If he told them what really happened to Mike Williams, they said, they would consider a deal. For weeks, Brian refused. He denied any involvement, insisting that he'd been unfairly targeted, that his only crime was loving Denise too much. But even he knew that wasn't true. The silence didn't last. In October 2017, after multiple interviews, Brian finally broke. The confession that followed was chilling, not just for its brutality, but for its calm precision. He didn't stumble. He didn't weep. He simply told the story as if he were describing someone else's nightmare. According to Brian, the morning of December 16, 2000, began like any other. He and Mike had planned to go duck hunting together at Lake Seminole. Denise had kissed her husband goodbye, fully aware he would never come home. The plan, she said, was simple. Brian would stage an accident. Mike would fall into the water and drown. The alligator theory would right itself. Denise would collect the insurance money, and the two of them, free from the burden of deception, could finally be together. But things didn't go as planned. The morning was colder than expected, the lake shrouded in fog. Mike and Brian launched the small aluminum boat just after dawn. They reached a quiet cove known as Stumpfield, a place riddled with half-submerged trees. It was there, Brian said, that he was supposed to bump Mike's boat and knock him overboard. The waders would fill with water. Mike would sink. It would look like a tragic accident. Except Mike didn't drown. When Brian nudged the boat, Mike managed to grab hold of a nearby stump and pull himself to safety. Soaked, shivering, and confused, he looked up at his friend and saw something in Brian's face that froze him. Panic replaced the plan. Brian pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast echoed across the fog. Mike Williams, 31 years old, devoted husband and father, was dead within seconds. Brian said he stood there for a long time, staring at the still water, realizing what he'd done. He hadn't just killed his best friend, he'd crossed a line from which neither he nor Denise could ever return. After the shooting, Brian dragged Mike's body back to the shore. He panicked at first, unsure of what to do. He couldn't leave the body in the lake. It would surface eventually. He couldn't take it home, so he did the only thing he could think of. He buried Mike near a remote area by Carr Lake, just off the edge of a hunting trail outside Tallahassee. The spot was secluded, overgrown, hidden by years of fallen leaves and brush. He dug a shallow grave with his bare hands and whatever tools he could find, covering the mound with debris and roots. Then, exhausted and numb, he returned to Lake Seminole to stage the accident. The boat, the shotgun, the life jacket, all placed to tell a story that would absolve him of guilt. When he returned to Denise, she didn't cry. She didn't panic. She asked one question: "Is it done?" That, Brian told investigators, was the moment he realized who she truly was. The FDLE listened carefully. They asked for proof, for something tangible. Brian said he could take them there. He drew a map, a crude outline of the lake's perimeter, with an X marked near a patch of swampy woods close to Tallahassee. 2 days later, investigators followed his directions. For 17 years, the area had been untouched, swallowed by nature. The team moved carefully through thick underbrush, stepping over branches and through waist-high weeds. When the cadaver dog stopped and began to bark, the searchers knew they had found him. The remains were skeletal, scattered but unmistakable. Items recovered from the scene confirmed what DNA would later prove. The body belonged to Jerry Michael Mike Williams. The discovery was both devastating and vindicating. For Cheryl, it was the end of the longest vigil of her life. Her son hadn't drowned. He hadn't been eaten by alligators. He'd been murdered and buried less than an hour from home. When the news broke, Tallahassee erupted in disbelief. The once respected Winchester family name was now synonymous with deceit. Denise Williams, the grieving widow who had collected sympathy and life insurance, was suddenly the focus of a homicide investigation. As agents began building their case, they discovered that Denise had been the mastermind from the beginning. She had orchestrated the insurance, the accident, even the timeline of the search. Every move she made after Mike's death, including marrying Brian, had been designed to cement the illusion of innocence. But now, that illusion was gone. In December 2017, 17 years after the morning Mike Williams vanished, his mother's prayers were answered. The truth had finally surfaced. Yet for Cheryl, justice was still just out of reach. Brian had confessed, yes, but Denise, the architect behind the betrayal, was still free. For investigators, that would be the next step. Because if Brian had finally cracked, it was only a matter of time before the woman who'd orchestrated it all would follow. With Mike's remains finally found, The FDLE turned their attention to the woman who had started it all, and the courtroom where Florida's most twisted love triangle would finally unravel. The truth, when it finally surfaced, came not with triumph but with a quiet, devastating clarity. 17 years of lies, rumors, and unanswered questions ended in a moment of certainty, a confirmation that both broke hearts and silenced doubts. Forensic analysts worked carefully in the small clearing near Carr Lake where Brian Winchester had led investigators. They sifted through soil, fragments of bone, and scraps of fabric long hidden beneath the earth. The site was silent except for the soft scrape of brushes and the distant hum of cicadas. It had been so long since Mike Williams had walked this earth, but in that moment he was no longer missing. He was finally found. When the lab confirmed the skeletal remains belonged to Mike, word spread quickly through Tallahassee. To the city that had once written off his death as a freak hunting accident, the revelation was staggering. To Cheryl Williams, it was vindication wrapped in heartbreak. "I knew he didn't drown," she whispered through tears, clutching a framed photo of her son. For nearly 2 decades, her voice had been the only one shouting into the void. Now finally, the world was listening. Brian Winchester's confession was the linchpin that made everything possible. In his statements to law enforcement, he detailed how the murder had unfolded, and worse, how long it had been planned. According to his testimony, he and Denise had spent months discussing how to rid themselves of Mike. They met in secret, crafting the details carefully, the insurance policies, the timing, the location. They calculated every angle, every possible alibi. The boating accident was supposed to be the perfect cover, tragic, believable, and irreversible, but fate had other plans. On that cold December morning, when Mike didn't drown as intended, Brian panicked. His fear of being exposed outweighed every ounce of loyalty he had ever felt. He raised the shotgun and fired point blank. In his confession, he described the sound, the deafening echo across the lake, the ringing in his ears, the way the mist seemed to swallow everything whole. When the silence returned, so did reality. Mike Williams, his best friend since high school, was dead. What happened next was just as calculated. Brian loaded the body into his truck and drove to the spot near Carr Lake, where he buried Mike in a shallow grave. He covered the site with debris, returned home, and later met with Denise. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for details. She just wanted to know it was done. For 17 years, both of them lived as if that morning had never happened, bound together by greed, fear, and silence. But in 2018, the silence broke. FDLE agents arrested Denise Williams at her office at Florida State University, where she worked as an administrator. Colleagues watched in stunned disbelief as officers escorted her out in handcuffs. To the community, she had been a symbol of perseverance, a woman widowed by tragedy, remarried to rebuild her life. But beneath that facade was a woman accused of orchestrating her husband's murder. The charges were staggering: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. When the news hit the airwaves, Tallahassee erupted. Reporters descended on the courthouse. National networks picked up the story. Headlines read like fiction: "Widow accused in husband's 2000 disappearance." In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Denise, dressed in soft blouses and muted colors, sat quietly as prosecutors painted her as the mastermind of a crime built on greed. Across the aisle sat Cheryl Williams, aged but unbroken, watching the woman she had long accused of betrayal finally face justice. The prosecution's case was built on Brian's confession, but it was reinforced by years of patterns: the quick insurance payout, the abrupt remarriage, and Denise's relentless efforts to distance herself from Cheryl. They argued that Denise had manipulated everyone around her, Brian, the police, even her own daughter, to maintain her secret. When Brian took the stand, the room went still. His voice was steady, his demeanor subdued. He described the murder in haunting detail: the sound of the shot, the weight of the body, the burial. But the most chilling part came when he recounted what Denise had said to him afterward. "She told me she couldn't divorce him," Brian testified. "She said divorce would ruin her reputation, ruin her church image. Murder was easier to hide." Denise didn't flinch. She stared ahead, expressionless. The defense tried to discredit Brian's testimony, calling him a manipulative ex-husband seeking revenge. They pointed to his kidnapping conviction, his plea deal, his history of obsession. But the evidence, the body, the insurance, the lies, spoke louder than any cross-examination could. Over the course of the trial, the courtroom became a theater of betrayal. Emails, letters, and phone records revealed how deeply intertwined Denise and Brian's deception had been. Witnesses recalled seeing them together in the months after Mike's death, their relationship more intimate than they'd ever admitted. It was a story not of passion, but of power and control. For Cheryl, each day of the trial was agony. She sat in the same seat every morning, holding her son's photograph in her lap. Some days she cried quietly. Other days she stared at Denise with a resolve forged from 17 years of grief. When asked why she attended every session, she simply said, "Because Mike can't." When closing arguments arrived, the prosecution left the jury with a question that cut through the legal jargon. How does a woman turn her husband's love into a death sentence? The jury deliberated for hours. Cheryl waited outside the courtroom, surrounded by friends and supporters who had walked this journey with her. Finally, the doors opened. The foreman stood, his voice trembling slightly as he read the verdict. Guilty. Denise Williams was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and accessory after the fact. The courtroom gasped. Cheryl's hands covered her face as tears fell, not from joy but from release. After nearly 2 decades, her son's truth had finally been spoken aloud under oath for the world to hear. Denise was sentenced to life in prison. For Cheryl, it was justice, an imperfect, delayed, but real. It's not about vengeance, she told reporters outside the courthouse. It's about truth. Mike deserved that. Even after an appellate court later overturned the murder conviction, the conspiracy charge stood firm, ensuring Denise would spend decades behind bars. The story that had haunted Florida for years had finally reached its reckoning. The lake that once held its secrets had given them back. But as the courtroom emptied and the cameras dimmed, one question still lingered. Not for the detectives or the lawyers, but for the rest of us. How does love turn into something deadly enough to destroy everything it touches? As the verdict echoed through the courthouse and the cameras turned away, Cheryl Williams walked outside into the Florida sunlight, the same light that had once glistened off Lake Seminole the morning her son vanished. But for her, the fight wasn't over yet. Because even with the truth exposed, the emotional wreckage of what remained would take years to heal. The December air outside the Leon County Courthouse was cool and still, the kind of winter day that carried a strange hush over Tallahassee. Inside, tension rippled through the courtroom like a held breath. After nearly 2 decades of silence, betrayal, and suspicion, everything had led to this moment. The verdict. Denise Williams sat motionless at the defense table, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable. Gone was the image of the grieving widow, replaced by a woman accused of orchestrating one of Florida's most haunting and calculated murders. Across the aisle, Cheryl Williams sat quietly, her fingers gripping a tissue, eyes fixed on the woman she had long believed responsible for her son's death. When the clerk began to read the verdict, the room fell silent. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a wave of emotion broke across the courtroom. Some gasped. Others whispered prayers. Cheryl bowed her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. After 17 years of relentless advocacy, of being dismissed, doubted, and told to let it go, she had finally heard the words she'd fought for. Justice. The prosecution's closing arguments had been devastating in their simplicity. They reminded the jury that this was not a crime of passion or impulse, but one of design, plotted over months, carried out with precision, and hidden beneath layers of deceit. Brian Winchester's testimony had been the linchpin, his words cutting through every defense Denise's lawyers tried to construct. He painted a picture of cold calculation, how Denise had used her beauty and composure to manipulate him, how she'd framed the murder not as a sin but as a solution. She said she couldn't divorce him, Brian told the jury. She said divorce would ruin her image, ruin her church life, ruin everything she'd built. She wanted him gone. He described in chilling detail how she'd orchestrated the plan, convincing Mike to take out a massive life insurance policy under the guise of protecting their family, then using Brian to carry out the act. He told the court how afterward she had shown no remorse, how she'd accepted the insurance money, staged her grief, and eventually married him. The very man who had killed her husband. The jury listened in stunned silence. Every word peeled away another layer of the woman they once believed was innocent. The defense, in contrast, tried to frame Brian as an unstable liar, a man with a motive to shift blame after his own arrest. They argued that his confession was self-serving, designed to reduce his sentence. But the evidence, the insurance, the timeline, the years of secrecy, formed a web that Denise could no longer escape. When the verdict was announced, the prosecutor glanced at Cheryl, offering a quiet nod. It was small, almost imperceptible, but to Cheryl it meant everything. After the hearing, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Cheryl stood before them, her voice soft but unwavering. "I never stopped believing," she said. "I knew my son didn't drown. I knew he was out there somewhere. And now he can rest." Behind her, the courthouse doors closed on Denise Williams, who was led away in handcuffs. Her face betrayed no emotion, but her silence spoke volumes. The woman who had spent 17 years maintaining control of her image, her story, her lies, had finally lost it all. In January 2019, Denise was sentenced to life in prison for conspiracy to commit murder and accessory after the fact. The courtroom was quieter this time. Cheryl sat near the front, surrounded by friends who had supported her through nearly 2 decades of grief and determination. When the sentence was read, she exhaled, not in triumph, but in peace. "It doesn't bring him back," she said, "but it brings the truth back to where it belongs." The story spread across the country, dominating headlines and true crime programs. The alligator theory, once accepted as fact, was now a chilling reminder of how deception can outlast justice, but not forever. Viewers were stunned by the depth of betrayal, the years of lies, and the sheer endurance of a mother's faith. Even as national attention grew, Cheryl remained humble. She didn't see herself as a hero, only a mother who refused to stop searching. "If I didn't fight for him," she told a reporter, "who would have?" In 2020, the case took one final legal turn. A Florida appellate court overturned Denise's murder conviction, ruling that there was insufficient evidence to prove she had actively participated in the killing itself. But the conspiracy charge, the plan she had forged with Brian Winchester, remained intact. For that, she would serve 30 years in prison. The partial reversal didn't shake Cheryl's resolve. "She's still where she belongs," she said, "and Mike still has his truth." For investigators, the Williams case became a symbol of persistence, a reminder that even the most carefully buried secrets have a way of resurfacing. For 17 years, the evidence had been hidden, scattered across lakes and lies. But when it emerged, it told a story of greed, manipulation, and the devastating power of silence. Brian Winchester remained in prison, serving his sentence for kidnapping Denise. His confession had spared him further charges in Mike's murder, but not the torment of living with what he'd done. Former friends said he'd become reclusive, spending most of his time in isolation. "He looks like a man haunted," one guard reportedly said. Meanwhile, Denise adjusted to life behind bars. Once admired for her poise and perfection, she now lived in a concrete cell, stripped of the control she'd once wielded so easily. She refused interviews, avoided contact with the media, and continued to insist on her innocence. But those who had followed the case for years knew better, because the truth was finally undeniable. Mike Williams hadn't vanished. He'd been betrayed, murdered, and buried, and only through the unyielding love of his mother had his story been brought back to light. Each year, Cheryl still visits the site near Carr Lake where her son's remains were found. She brings fresh flowers, sometimes a note, and always a prayer. She doesn't stay long, just enough to whisper, "We did it, Mike. You're home now." The lake that once swallowed the lie has long since calmed, its surface glassy and still. But beneath that peace lies a story that shook a community and proved that even the darkest truth cannot stay buried forever. Justice, in the end, had not erased the pain. It had not restored the years or the laughter or the life stolen from a man who loved too deeply. But it had given something sacred, closure. And for a mother who had stood for 17 years against the tide, that was enough. As Cheryl placed her hand against her son's gravestone and whispered goodbye, she knew the story wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about every voice silenced by deception and every truth waiting. just beneath the surface to be found. In the quiet neighborhoods of Tallahassee, people still talk about the Mike Williams case, not in whispers of gossip anymore, but in tones of reverence, disbelief, and uneasy reflection. It's the story of a man who vanished, a woman who deceived, and a mother who refused to stop searching. 17 years of lies, one confession, and the slow grind of truth later. What remains is not just a solved crime, but a cautionary tale about love, loyalty, and the long reach of justice. Today, the story of Jerry Mike Williams lives far beyond the borders of Florida. It's studied by investigators as a landmark example of what persistence can achieve when evidence seems lost and systems fail. It's discussed in criminology classes, cited in documentaries, and remembered by those who followed the twists and turns from the very beginning. But for the people closest to it, for Cheryl, for Mike's daughter, for those who once called Denise a friend, the legacy is far more personal. Mike's daughter, who was just a toddler when he disappeared, is now an adult. She grew up under the shadow of competing truths, one told by her mother, another whispered by her grandmother. For years, she lived in the confusion of conflicting versions of her father's death. First, she was told he had drowned. Later, that he had been taken by alligators. Then came the revelation that the people she loved most were responsible for it. It's the kind of trauma that doesn't fade. It reshapes you. She has rarely spoken publicly, but those who know her say she carries herself with quiet strength, a mirror of the man whose life was stolen from her before she ever had the chance to truly know him. Cheryl Williams, now in her 70s, has become a symbol of resilience. She turned her pain into purpose, channeling her energy into advocacy for other families of missing persons and unsolved cases. She speaks at events, writes letters, and mentors parents who are where she once was, standing alone, begging for someone to listen. Don't ever stop, she tells them. The truth doesn't die. It just waits to be found. In interviews, Cheryl often describes the years after the verdict as both healing and haunting. People think justice brings peace, she once said. But it's not peace, it's just clarity. You still live with the ache. You just finally know where to put it. The FDLE investigators who reopened the case still regard it as one of the most haunting of their careers. They speak about it with a mix of pride and lingering sorrow. We were cleaning up what others had missed, one agent admitted. But what really solved this case wasn't us, it was Cheryl. She refused to let it die. Her unwavering fight forced a state system to listen, not through force but through sheer endurance. And that, perhaps, is the legacy that burns brightest. A mother's faith standing taller than bureaucracy, corruption, or the slow decay of time. The Williams case has since become a teaching tool in law enforcement circles. Detectives use it to illustrate the importance of questioning early assumptions, especially in cases that seem too neat. It's now a textbook example of what can happen when investigators overlook inconsistencies, like the impossibility of alligators feeding in cold weather or the condition of evidence found months too late. For many, the case also redefined what a cold case truly means. It wasn't technology that solved it. Not DNA, not digital evidence, not forensic innovation. It was human persistence. It was the refusal to accept an easy lie. When true crime documentaries revisit the case, they often linger on a single image. Cheryl standing outside the Florida Capitol, year after year holding her sign, "Where's my son?" Rain or shine, she was there, a living reminder that some truths refuse to drown. That photograph has since become symbolic. A testament to what love looks like when it's armed with determination instead of hope. Tallahassee itself changed too. The community that once dismissed Cheryl's grief as obsession began to see her as a hero. Neighbors who had turned away now greet her with hugs. Reporters who once covered her skeptically now cite her as an example of perseverance. Even officers who doubted her now admit that without her, Mike's case would have remained buried forever. The Williams case also reshaped conversations about the darker side of relationships, how manipulation, greed, and control can hide behind the mask of domestic normalcy. Denise Williams had embodied the image of perfection, a church-going wife, a devoted mother. But underneath, she harbored a quiet ruthlessness that fooled everyone around her. Her story became a sobering reminder that evil doesn't always wear a face of rage. Sometimes it wears a smile. In classrooms across Florida, the case is occasionally used to teach young people about ethics, trust, and human psychology. The question that always follows, how could she do it, remains as haunting as ever. For Cheryl, however, the legacy isn't about Denise or Brian or even the courtroom victory. It's about her son, the man he was, not the crime that ended his life. She remembers Mike as a boy who worked 2 jobs to help his parents, as a student who rose through sheer willpower, as a husband who believed in love, and as a father who adored his little girl. Every year on December 16th, the day he disappeared, Cheryl visits his grave. She brings fresh flowers and sits quietly, often for hours. Sometimes she talks to him. Sometimes she just listens to the wind through the trees. In those moments, she says she feels closest to him, like all the years of searching, all the pain, had led back to this one peaceful place. "I don't think justice ever really ends," she once said softly in an interview. "It just changes shape. You stop fighting for answers and start fighting to make sure the story isn't forgotten." And that's what she's done. The Williams case continues to echo through true crime documentaries, podcasts, and legal studies, but at its core, it remains a story about one simple truth. Love, when stripped of illusion, can be both the purest force and the most dangerous weapon. Mike Williams's name is now carved not just in stone, but in memory, a reminder of how fragile trust can be, how destructive greed becomes, and how truth, no matter how deeply buried, always fights its way to the surface. For Cheryl, that's enough. When asked once what she would say to other families searching for their loved ones, she didn't hesitate. "Don't wait for someone else to fight your battle," she said. "Sometimes justice is just you, one person, one voice, refusing to let go." And then she smiled faintly, the way only someone who has survived the storm can. Because even though Lake Seminole once hid a body, it could never hide a mother's love. As the years go on and the ripples of Mike's story reach new generations, one question still lingers like the mist over the lake. If Cheryl Williams hadn't fought, if she had accepted the story the world told her, would anyone have ever known what really happened beneath those still waters? 17 years. That's how long it took for one mother's voice to echo louder than lies, to pierce through the silence of an entire lake, and to drag the truth into the light. 17 years of letters, protests, prayers, and relentless determination, all for one thing: her son's name. Jerry Michael Mike Williams didn't drown that cold December morning in 2000. He didn't fall victim to an accident or to nature's cruelty. He was betrayed by the people who stood closest to him, the ones who promised love and loyalty. A husband, a father, a man devoted to family and faith, taken not by chance but by choice. For so long, that betrayal hid behind a mask, behind headlines about alligators and tragic hunting accidents, behind legal paperwork declaring him dead, behind life insurance payouts, and behind the polished smiles of those who thought they had gotten away with it. But truth has a pulse of its own, and it doesn't vanish, it waits. And for 17 years, Cheryl Williams refused to let that pulse fade. Her journey was one of unimaginable pain and perseverance. While others told her to move on, she stood alone, holding signs on street corners, writing letters every morning, and reminding anyone who would listen that her son didn't drown. He was murdered. For years, she was dismissed as a grieving mother lost in denial. But grief and madness are not the same thing. Sometimes they are the fire that burns through the darkness. Brian Winchester's confession in 2017 cracked open the carefully built illusion. His voice, trembling, defeated, desperate, finally admitted what Cheryl had always known. The truth had been buried, not lost. He told investigators how Denise Williams, Mike's wife, had planned everything, how she'd chosen greed over love, image over humanity, and plotted a murder that would look like tragedy. The story unraveled like a slow-motion nightmare. 2 lovers staging a perfect death, 2 decades of deceit, and a single mother clawing against time to find her son. But when Mike's remains were unearthed near Tallahassee, it wasn't just a discovery. It was a resurrection. For the first time, there was proof. For the first time, there was peace. When the verdict finally came in December 2018, guilty, the courtroom fell still. Cheryl wept softly, her hands clasped around her son's photograph. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Justice had arrived late, carrying the weight of years, but it had arrived all the same. Denise Williams, once the face of tragedy, was now the face of betrayal, sentenced to decades in prison for conspiring to end the life of the man who had loved her most. For Cheryl, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, restoring her son's dignity, his memory, and his truth. The story that had once been swallowed by water and silence was now etched into the record of Florida's most haunting cold cases, solved not by luck or technology, but by love. Today, the name Mike Williams stands for something far greater than one man's tragedy. It stands for every family who refuses to give up when the world turns its back. It's a reminder that justice is not a moment, but a movement, one fueled by persistence, heart, and the refusal to believe that silence is the final answer. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of all, that one mother's love proved stronger than lies, stronger than time, stronger than the weight of death itself, because justice may be slow, but it is never truly silent. If this case moved you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered,